4 a.m. The penthouse was dark. But Du Young was not asleep. He was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city like a man who owned it. Because he did. With a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched in 40 minutes. The ice had given up. The city below had gone completely quiet. Just the amber glow of street lamps and the occasional sweep of headlights on wet asphalt 26 floors beneath his feet. He had a meeting in 4 hours. 3 men were currently zip-tied in a warehouse on the east side, waiting on his decision. $17 million in a shipment had gone missing somewhere between the port and his hands, and 2 of his lieutenants were currently too afraid to look him in the eye. Du Young had a lot of things demanding his attention tonight, and yet, he was standing at this window, watching the street, because Keela wasn't home yet. Down below, a matte black Maybach rounded the corner with the quiet arrogance of a car that had never been told no. Stepped out. Du Young's hand tightened, stepped out. Du Young's hand tightened around the glass. She was in white. A razor-sharp white power suit that had no business looking that clean at 4 in the morning. Her posture was not the posture of a woman who had just survived a long night. It was the posture of a woman who had run the night. Head back. Shoulders squared. One hand accepting a briefcase from the man leaning out of the Maybach door with the casual ease of 2 people who had done this handoff 100 times before. Du Young knew that car. He knew that license plate. He would know it in the dark, half blind, with a gun to his head. It belonged to Jin. The glass shattered in his hand. He didn't notice the blood until it hit the marble floor. He didn't feel the cut at all. He was watching Jin lean out of the window and say something to Keela that made her throw her head back and laugh. Really laugh. The full kind. The kind she used to only give to him, before she turned and walked through the lobby doors without looking back once. For 4 years, Du Young had kept his wife at the outermost edge of his world on purpose. Cold, distant, deliberately unbothered. He had told himself it was protection, that his enemies would never touch something they believed he didn't care about. That the coldest thing he could do for her was love her like she meant nothing, and it had worked. His enemies had left her alone. The only problem was that somewhere in those 4 years, while he was busy pretending she didn't matter, Keela had stopped waiting for him to change his mind. The blood was already drying by the time he moved. He looked at his palm the way a man looks at damage he caused himself, not with surprise, not with pain, just with the cold, methodical recognition that something needed to be addressed, before it became inconvenient. He pulled the largest shard free, set it on the windowsill with a precision that was almost ceremonial, wrapped his hand in the hem of his shirt, and stood there in the dark, watching the lobby doors close behind a woman who had not looked up. Not once. That was the detail that stayed. In 4 years of calculated distance, of strategic coldness, of an emotional architecture so airtight that his own men believed the marriage was contractual at best, he had still, always been watching her. And she had always, on some level, known he was there. The small adjustments she made when he entered a room, the pause before she answered him that was slightly longer than necessary, not hesitation, something more like decision. The way she used to leave the living room lamp on at a specific wattage, warm-toned, the kind that said, "I'm here," without saying anything at all. She hadn't looked up. She hadn't checked. Hadn't glanced at the 26th floor. Hadn't done. She had walked through the lobby doors and was standing in the middle of the room, her eyes wide and her mouth open. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you." She had walked through the lobby doors and the city had closed around her like water over a stone, and she had not looked back. Du Young stood at the window until the street was empty again. Then he went to find the photograph. It had come the way dangerous things always come, without announcement. Not through his usual channels, not to the office address, not to the 3 rotating P.O. boxes his operations team cycled through on a 6-week schedule. Not to any of the ghost entities his name was buried beneath, in 4 different incorporated structures. It came to the penthouse. Hand-delivered. his name in handwriting he didn't recognize, which meant someone had gone to the specific trouble of using a hand he couldn't trace. His security team cleared it in the lobby. No device, no contaminant. Standard white envelope, standard paper stock. One photograph inside. Keela, private dining room. White suit. Hair up. One hand on a document, the other resting at the edge of the table with the relaxed authority of a woman who owned the surface she was touching. Across from her, Jin. Not across the table from her, which would have meant negotiation. Leaning in. The body language of someone entirely at ease in the conversation, which was the language of someone who had been in that conversation many times before. Du Young had turned the photograph over. She chose good company. Can you blame her? He had read it twice. He had set it face down on his desk. He had poured 2 fingers of whiskey, carried it to the window, and not drunk it once in 40 minutes, while he waited for her to come home, and gave Jin's message exactly the reaction Jin had designed it to produce. He knew that. He knew it while it was happening. He had filed it under known manipulation and emotional compromise and still stood at the window, still watched the street, still felt the glass crack in his hand when the Maybach pulled up, and she stepped out laughing. Here's what nobody in Du Young's world would ever have believed. He was terrified. Not of Jin. Not of the photograph. Not of whatever infrastructure Keela was building in the margins of his operations. He had figured out most of the shape of it, and what he'd figured out had not scared him. What had scared him was the laugh. The full kind, the head-back kind, the kind she used to only give to him. She thought she had him figured out. She was so wrong it almost destroyed her. That night at the gallery, Keela Monroe had made an assessment based on available evidence and reasonable inference, which was, professionally, exactly how she operated. Man standing apart from the room, ink at his collar. Eyes doing threat assessment on the exits. The specific stillness of someone who had decided the space was beneath him, but had a reason to be in it anyway. She had thought, interesting. She had thought, controlled. She had thought, in the way you think things you aren't ready to think directly. Someone I could talk to without performing anything. She had not thought, this man is going to build a wall around me out of love, and then live on the wrong side of it for 4 years, while I slowly become someone he doesn't recognize, and I stop recognizing him too. You never think that part at the beginning. The gallery was one of those midtown Atlanta spaces that existed primarily as a tax vehicle for the man who owned the building and a networking opportunity for the people inside it. Keela was there with Trish, who had immediately located the 3 most powerful people in the room by net worth, not by volume. Trish was precise about this distinction and was currently engaged in what she called information gathering and what most people would recognize as asking the right questions while appearing to do nothing at all. Keela had drifted. She did that at events. Trish was the social engine. Keela was the analyst, the one who moved to the edges and watched the room from the places where the room wasn't watching back. That was how she found him, or how he let her find him. She wouldn't understand the distinction until much later. You look like a man who came to this party by accident, she said. He looked at her. Really looked. Not the performative attention of a man deciding whether to bother, but the genuine, focused attention of someone taking an actual inventory. His expression didn't shift, but she saw something move behind it. A small rearrangement of whatever he kept behind his eyes. I don't do things by accident, he said. His voice was low, level. The kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had never needed to compete with anything. Then you look like a man who came here and immediately regretted the decision. The corner of his mouth moved, approximately 2 millimeters. Not quite a smile, but structurally related to one, like the blueprint existed and he'd elected not to build it. Du Young, he said. Keela. And before you ask, no, I don't know whose art this is. I'm here for the free wine and the networking. I stopped pretending otherwise about 45 minutes ago. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he flagged down a waiter, took 2 glasses of wine, and handed her one. She told herself it was a nice start. She had no idea it was the last easy moment they'd have for 5 years. The first year, Keela cooked dinner. Not every night. She wasn't performing anything. Wasn't auditioning for a role in a marriage she'd already been cast in. She cooked because her grandmother, Miss Adays, had taught her that feeding people was a language, and because some stubborn, warm part of her believed that a shared meal was the kind of ordinary anchor that could hold 2 people together while they figured out the deeper water. Du Young came home late. She had known that going in. She had not been warned about the silence, not the silence of absence. She could have survived that. Could have learned its shape the way you learn the shape of any room you have to navigate in the dark. This was something else. This was Du Young present, physically, materially, sitting across a table with his hands around a glass she had poured for him, and still completely unreachable. Eyes on his phone or on a middle distance she couldn't locate on any map she owned. Monosyllables that were technically answers and contained absolutely nothing. No warmth. No friction even. Just the mechanical minimum of a man who had decided, for reasons she didn't yet have access to, that she would receive exactly this much of him and nothing more. She asked him once, late in year 2, if something was wrong. He looked up. Dark eyes. Unreadable. No. She waited. He looked back down. That was the entire conversation. Miss Adays, when Keela described it months later without describing it directly, said nothing for a long moment, and then quoted something about a woman who waters a stone and then wonders why nothing grows. Trish was less poetic. Leave him, Keela. That man is going to hollow you out if you let him. Keela didn't leave. She couldn't explain why, for a long time. She told herself she had seen something real at the gallery. Something worth the patience. That marriages moved through seasons and this was a long winter. That the man who had flagged down a waiter and handed her wine with 2 millimeters of almost smile was still in there, just buried under whatever weight he carried home from a life she didn't have full access to yet. She told herself many things in the first 2 years. By year 3, she had stopped talking to herself about it entirely. She had started watching something else. Here's what she didn't know about the world she'd married into. The men who made the most noise owned the least. She had figured that out by year 3. She'd had time. The men who came through the penthouse for meetings, the ones who looked at her like a liability when they realized whose wife she was, whose presence rearranged the air pressure in whatever room they entered. Those men were loud. They performed power the way amateurs perform anything. Too much. Too obviously, covering the gaps. The truly dangerous people were the quiet ones, the ones who sat in corners, the ones who, when everyone else finished talking, held the piece of paper that everything else ran on. Du Young was the quietest person she had ever met, and she had spent 3 years inside his organization without being in it, watching the infrastructure, tracing the architecture, reverse engineering a system from the outside, the same way she had once mapped supply chains for clients who needed to understand where their value was leaking. She had been a logistics consultant before all of this. Very good. The kind of good that made people uncomfortable when they realized what she'd figured out about their operation in under 6 weeks. She had spent 3 years applying that brain to the most complex system she'd ever been adjacent to, and she had done it quietly, the way you do things when you've been trained, by proximity, by necessity, not to be noticed. The decision didn't arrive dramatically. There was no cinematic morning, just a Tuesday. Just the table set for 2, and the chair across from her empty, and the specific clarifying thought. I am 31 years old. I am invisible in my own home. And I am the only person in this room who finds that unacceptable. She cleared both plates, ate standing at the kitchen counter, and began. She made one critical error in the first month of building. She underestimated how long it would take to become invisible to his men. They were good. She had to give them that. She spotted the first one within a week. A man who appeared at 3 separate locations with the specific bad luck of someone whose face she had an above-average memory for. She didn't react, didn't adjust her route. She let him watch her do nothing interesting for 11 days before she began, slowly, to construct the performance of a woman who was simply filling her days. The real work happened underneath it. The wardrobe shift was first, and yes, Trish gets credit. "You dress like someone who is trying not to be noticed," Trish had said, with the loving precision of a woman who had been telling hard truths since 2009. "And I need you to explain to me why, when you are built like that, you are wearing beige." Keela had looked at her closet. She had looked at the soft colors, the careful fabrics, the choices she had been making without fully clocking the pattern underneath them. She had been dressing for a marriage that asked her to take up less space. She had been making herself smaller in fabric, in color, in the amount of room she allowed herself to occupy when she walked into a room. She donated most of it the following week. The first white suit changed something. Not in the room, in her. She felt it the moment she put it on, the way the structure of it sat on her shoulders like a decision she'd already made. She wore it to her first real meeting, a port logistics contact she had cultivated over 3 careful months, and watched the man across the table recalibrate in real time. Not because of the suit, because of what she laid out on the table alongside it. Numbers, projections. The kind of gap analysis that makes people feel briefly embarrassed by how much they'd been leaving on the floor. She had his trust by the end of the 3rd meeting. She had his network by the end of the 3rd month. The first rule she gave herself: hire no one who knew her husband. The second: meet in places his men didn't watch. The third, and this one she got directly from 4 years of studying the most controlled operator she had ever encountered. Privacy and power are the same word. She moved, like dew. Young moved. Deliberately. Quietly. She varied her routes daily, never the same turns in the same order, the same way water finds different paths to the same destination. She had 3 phones by month 6. She built relationships the way you build anything that needs to last. Slowly, redundantly, with multiple points of contact so that no single failure could collapse the whole structure. Sung found her in month 4. She burned him in week 2. She had watched Du Young's surveillance protocols for 3 years from inside the penthouse. She knew his methods the way you know the layout of a house you've lived in, not by studying it, just by moving through it so many times that the knowledge becomes physical. When Sung reported to Du Young that he had lost her, Keela was across the city having coffee with a port operations director who had just agreed to restructure 3 access agreements in her name. She felt nothing dramatic about it, just the quiet satisfaction of a system working as designed. He put his best man on her and she burned him in 11 days. Du Young had read Sung's report 3 times and felt something he had no clean category for. Not anger. Anger was useful, directional. It pointed at something. This was more like standing in a room you thought you knew and finding all the walls had moved. She had 3 phones. She changed her route every day with the specific variability of someone who had studied route changing. Her meetings were in restaurants with no reservations and management relationships that required months of cultivation. The people she met with were clean on the surface, and he knew, from 3 decades of operating in the space between what things look like and what they were, that clean on the surface in this city meant very carefully constructed. These were not the movements of a woman having an affair. He had built the framework for detecting that particular pattern himself. 15 years ago, out of professional necessity, he knew what it looked like. This wasn't it. These were the movements of a professional, a sophisticated one. Someone who moved with the specific economy of a person who had been trained, or had trained herself, in exactly the methods he had spent years perfecting. He doubled the surveillance, Sung +2, then Sung +4. Then a full rotation with 6-hour shifts and 2-man overlaps at the handoff point, the way you cover a principal, not a person of interest. She evaded every single one. "Sir, I lost her. Sir. Fifth and the underground parking. I had 4 men on the perimeter. Sir. There's no record of how she crossed. He sat in his real office, 3 floors below street level, the one where disappointed men had learned to dread the summons. And he sat with the knowledge that his wife was a ghost in his own city, moving through a network she had apparently built in the margins of a marriage he had been treating like a formality. And then the envelope came. And then the photograph. And then the Maybach. And then her laugh. He understood, standing at that window with broken glass and blood on his hand, that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Not strategic. Personal. The kind that doesn't appear in any operations review because it isn't a professional failure. He had spent 4 years making her invisible to protect her. He had been so convincing that he had made her invisible to himself. Have you ever had to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's world? Keela didn't just leave. She built an empire in his blind spot. If you are loving this status flip, hit that subscribe button right now, because Du Young is about to find out exactly who his wife really is, and you do not want to miss this boardroom showdown. He was waiting when she came home. Not at the window. Center of the living room. Lights on. The broken glass already swept. He'd done that mechanically without deciding to, the way you do small tasks when your hands need something to do, and your mind is somewhere it can't be followed. The blood on the marble had dried to a dark crescent shape. Neither of them looked at it. He had been standing there 40 minutes. He had rehearsed nothing. That was how she knew. The moment the elevator opened and she saw him, that whatever was about to happen was real. Keela stepped off and didn't stop moving. Briefcase on the console table. Jacket off the shoulders, hung with the unhurried patience of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the last 4 years, that she would never again perform urgency for a man who had spent 4 years performing indifference at her. He crossed the room, held out the photograph. She looked at it, then at him. Where did you get this? That's not the question I'm asking. It's the question I'm answering. She set the photograph face down on the console table without touching it again. Someone sent you that to get a specific reaction, and you're standing in my living room at 4 in the morning having exactly that reaction. So I'm asking where you got it, because I want to know who thinks I'm a useful instrument. Something moved across his face. He pushed past it. Are you involved with Jin? The silence that followed was not the silence of someone caught. It was the silence of a woman deciding whether the person in front of her had earned an honest answer or a devastating one, and arriving, generously, at honest. No, she said. I'm involved with Jin's shipping contracts, his port access agreements, and his financial infrastructure, which I've been building toward for 18 months, which has nothing to do with you and nothing to do with what you think this is. A pause, precise as a scalpel. Jin sent you that photograph because he knew it would make you act irrationally. He knows you very well. He knows you well enough, Du Young said. Yes, because unlike you, he's been paying attention. She hadn't meant it to land the way it did. He could see that, in the small tightening around her eyes, the flash of something that might have been regret at her own precision. But she didn't take it back. She was done taking things back in this apartment. Keela. Do you know what I want? Her voice had changed, gone clean and flat in a way that was colder than anger, because anger has temperature and this had none. I want you to say what you actually mean. Not the photograph, not Jin, not whatever performance this is. What do you actually want to say to me? Because if you are going to stand in this room and be present, actually present, then say the actual thing. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm not going to let Jin use you, he said. It was the wrong thing. He knew it while it was happening, but it was also, underneath all the wrong, buried under 4 years of disciplined silence, the truest thing he had managed to say to her since year 1. She picked up her briefcase. I don't belong to Jin, she said. I don't belong to you. I don't belong to anyone in this city or this business or this penthouse. She looked at him with eyes that were completely steady and completely done. That's the answer to the question you were actually asking. She went upstairs. DeYoung stood in the living room with the photograph, and the dried blood, and the absolute, irreversible knowledge that he had just run out of time. He made the call before dawn. Operations Director, Security Chief, 3 lieutenants he kept for work that never appeared in any record. He gave the order in the measured, deliberate cadence he used when precision mattered more than speed, the voice that meant this is not a discussion, and watched the room fill with the specific quality of attention that his men produced, when they understood what was being asked of them was not routine. He told himself it was protection, that Jin had drawn a line with the photograph, and lines had to be addressed. That whatever Keela was building, she was building it, inside a world that had rules. And the first rule was that you did not let a rival place his people adjacent to something you... He stopped the thought there, filed it under operational necessity. The compound location arrived by 9, guard rotations by noon, blind spots in Jin's perimeter mapped and annotated by the time Du Young was eating a lunch he didn't taste. He had the layout in front of him for hours. He looked at it with the same quality of attention he gave every operation, methodical, cold, nothing personal. He circled the boardroom. "Tonight," he said. His men moved. He sat with his lunch and his schematics and the truth he was not saying out loud, which was, this is not strategy. This was a man who had spent 4 years being so disciplined about the distance that he had lost track of when the distance stopped being a tool and started being the whole of what he was offering her. This was a man who had watched her rebuild herself into someone extraordinary in the space. His silence created, and was now mobilizing 12 armed men because she had laughed in a car he didn't own. He knew all of that. He noted it in the part of his mind that always watched himself from a slight remove. He gave the order anyway, because he could not, would not, let Jin be the one to show her she mattered. That had always been his job. He had simply forgotten, for 4 years, to do it. The rain came in at 8, and by 10, the streets around Jin's territory were running dark and slick and entirely empty. DeYoung moved with 12 men through the wet dark like a verdict that had already been written and was simply in the process of being delivered. Not an army, an argument. The specific, precise number of people required to make a point without making a spectacle. The outer perimeter cleared in 4 minutes, quietly. The kind of clearing that leaves men breathing and zip-tied and reconsidering their career trajectory, which was mercy by the standards of this city and, of them, just behind the front. Of them, just behind the front. The particular economy of a man who had been doing this since before most of his team had their first professional assignment. 2nd floor, a security door. The exchange lasted as long as his patience held, which was not long. 3rd floor, 4th. The building was quieter than it should have been. That registered, filed, bypassed. He was past the point of clean intelligence. He had been past it since the photograph. He was in the thing now, operating on something older and less rational than strategy, and some contained, watchful part of him knew it, and the rest of him did not care. 5th floor, corridor outside the executive suite. Empty. No guards. No rotation. Just a corridor lit at low level. The specific amber of expensive lighting installed by someone who understood atmosphere, extending all the way to a door at the far end that stood fractionally, deliberately, ajar. DeYoung stopped. His security chief materialized at his shoulder, looked at the corridor, looked at him. "Sir." "I know." He moved forward anyway, because the alternative was to stop, to think. To let the part of him that always watched from a distance catch up with the part of him that was standing outside a boardroom about to break a door down over a woman who had looked him in the eye with absolute composure and told him she belonged to no one. He put his hand flat against the door. It swung open without resistance. The room was lit. Not the cold fluorescent of a space in active operational use. Warm, low, deliberate. The kind of lighting you arrange in advance because you have planned for the arrival of a specific person at a specific moment, and you want them to see exactly what you need them to see. Long table, 12 chairs, a wall of windows behind it running the full width of the room, and, behind the glass, the city in the rain. Every light refracted and doubled on the wet street below, the whole skyline doing what city skylines do when it rains, becoming somehow more itself, sharper, the kind of beautiful that only appears when something gets washed clean. Du Young stood in the doorway and took it in. At the far end of the table, in the chair that faced the door, the chair that saw everyone who entered before they saw you. The chair that was never accidentally occupied by anyone who understood what it meant. Keela, white suit, jacket on. Immaculate in a way that suggested she had been here long enough to settle, but had not been here long enough to rumple anything. Her hands rested on a document in front of her with the ease of a woman who had all night and the patience to use every minute of it. At the table around her, 3 men Du Young recognized from Jin's organization, not lieutenants, principals, the ones who held paper, sat with the careful stillness of people who had been briefed on the shape of the evening and were choosing their questions carefully. At Keela's right hand, Jin, not at the head of his own table, beside her, in the chair that said advisor, second, support. A chair that Du Young had designed equivalents of in his own rooms and understood immediately and completely. Keela looked up when he came through the door. She did not look surprised. She did not look afraid. She looked, with those dark, steady eyes, like a woman who had set a table and was mildly, professionally interested in whether the right guest had arrived. "You're early," she said. Behind Du Young, 12 men had filed in and stopped. He heard their recalibration in their silence. The specific quality of stillness that occurs when a room refuses to behave like the room you armored yourself to enter. He walked the length of the table. He stopped at the far end. Looked at her hands on the document. Looked at her. "What is this?" She turned the document and slid it toward him in one motion. He read the first page. He read the second. He read the third. Port access agreements. Southern Corridor shipping contracts. Distribution infrastructure across 4 territories. The infrastructure that ran beneath his organization the way pipes run beneath a city. Invisible until they aren't. Essential in the specific way you only understand when someone else has their hand on the valve. His territories. His infrastructure. In her name. Not transferred. Not taken. Not negotiated away from him while his back was turned. Built. Constructed in parallel, brick by brick, in the gaps he hadn't watched because he had been so certain the gaps were empty. Built using the relationships he had never invested in, the channels he hadn't thought to monitor, the 19 months of early mornings and late Maybachs, and white suits and surveillance routes that his best men could not crack. She had built an empire inside the margins of his. And it was real. It was documented. It was, by every measure that mattered in this world, legitimate. 18 months, he said. His voice came out very quiet. 19, she said. You were close. Jin, to her right, said nothing. He had the expression of a man watching an investment pay out exactly as modeled, and was professional enough to keep it quiet. Du Young looked at the document. He looked at Keela. He looked at the document again. And then, Du Young, who had not bent his knee to anything in 17 years, who had built an empire on the specific foundational premise that he would not, pulled out the chair directly across from his wife. Not the head chair. The chair of a man who has run out of performance and arrived, finally, at the actual thing underneath it. He sat down. I need to tell you something, he said. The room went very still. Not the stillness of people waiting for a threat. The stillness of people who understand they are witnessing something that does not happen often and cannot be talked about afterward. The first year, Du Young said, when I was... He stopped, started again with the measured, difficult pace of a man translating something that has never been in language before. I had a man who worked for me. Good man. Family man. Daughter who was 5. I put him on a job I assessed as low risk. A pause. My assessment was wrong. His daughter doesn't have a father anymore. He didn't look away from Keela. 2 weeks after that, there was an attempt on my life. 3rd one that year. Not serious. I handled it. But I stood in the penthouse that night and I looked at you. Something moved across his face then, raw in a way that had no professional category, in a way she had never seen in 4 years, or the time before them. And I understood that I had brought you into a world where the people closest to me were the most exposed, that his daughter didn't have a father because I miscalculated, and that if I ever miscalculated about you. He stopped. I understood that loving you loudly was the most dangerous thing I could do to you in this city, that the coldest thing, the safest thing, was to make every man who watched me believe you were incidental, a formality, that you didn't matter. The rain moved against the windows behind Keela's head. The city below went on doing what cities do. And you never told me? She said. No. You let me believe I was invisible. Yes. For 4 years. Yes. He held her eyes. I watched you every day. From far enough that no one would know I was watching. I kept the lamp on in my office every night. You kept it on in the living room. When you stopped, he stopped. I didn't know how to reach across 4 years of silence without shattering everything I had built to keep you safe. So I built a wall between you and my enemies. And I stood on the wrong side of it. Keela was quiet for a long time. Long enough for the room to breathe. Long enough for Jin to find the middle distance and study it, with great interest. Long enough for the 3 principals at the table to quietly discover a collective need to review documents they had already read. You should have told me, she said finally. Not angry. Something on the other side of anger, the kind of clarity that only exists after a long time of not having it. I know. I would have stayed. I was already staying. I just needed. She looked at him across the document, across the table, across 4 years. I needed to know I mattered. You were the only thing that mattered. His voice was very low. Every decision, every move, every calculation for 4 years. You were always the fixed point. I was always calculating around you. I just never told you. He reached across the table, past the contracts, past 19 months of evidence that she had built something extraordinary in the space his silence created, past everything. And he placed his hand over hers. His hand was larger. On the palm, a deep, raw cut from broken glass on a marble floor, the edges dark and fresh, earned in a penthouse 26 floors above a street she had walked through without looking up. She looked at his hand. She looked at him. This is mine, she said. Not a question. Not a challenge. The clean, declarative statement of a woman who had done the math herself and arrived at the answer without anyone's help. Yes, he said. And yours is still yours. I would give you that too. His eyes were steady on hers. If you wanted it. She looked at her husband for a long moment. This man who had built a wall out of love and lived on the wrong side of it, who had watched her from the distance he had constructed to protect her, who had let her believe she was invisible while she was, in fact, the single point around which everything else had been calibrated. She felt something settle in her chest. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Not all of it. Not all at once. But the room where forgiveness is built. The foundation of it. I don't want your empire, she said. I built my own. The corner of his mouth moved, 2 millimeters, in the direction it had been trying to complete for 5 years. I know, he said. I've been watching. Jin cleared his throat with the specific discretion of a man who had facilitated something extraordinary and was ready to return to being a person in a room rather than an instrument of narrative. He began gathering his papers with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been paid what he was owed and considered the account settled. Keela stood. She picked up the document. She looked at Du Young, still sitting in the chair across from her, and she extended one hand. He looked at it. He stood. He took it. He took it. And she felt the rough, bandaged edge of his palm under her fingers, and they walked out of the boardroom side by side. Not him ahead, not her following. Side by side, through the door and down the corridor where no guards had waited. Down the stairs and through the lobby, and into the rain-slicked street where the city was doing what it always did. Running, lit, enormous, entirely indifferent to the private wars of the people moving through it. The Maybach was waiting. Keela's driver, her vehicle, her choice. She got in first, and Du Young followed without being asked, which was itself a language she understood. In the back seat, in the dark, the city moving past the windows in amber and black, they were quiet for a while. "The lamp," she said. "What?" "In the living room. Start leaving it on." He looked at her profile against the window, the line of her jaw, the white of her jacket collar against her skin. He had been looking at her for 5 years from a distance engineered specifically, so that no one would know he was looking, and he was very tired of the distance. "Okay," he said. She kept her eyes on the city. "And Du Young?" "Yes. Next time you decide to protect me from something..." A pause. "Tell me first. I'm very good at protecting myself. Moved far enough to finish what it had moved far enough to finish what it had been trying to build since a gallery in uptown Charlotte. A waiter, 2 glasses of wine, and a man who had been evaluating exits while a woman walked toward him instead of away." "I know," he said. "I've always known." The car moved through the city. The rain softened. The lamps glittered on the wet asphalt below them like something scattered deliberately. Signals for people who knew how to read them. Behind them, in a boardroom on the 5th floor of a building that now had very different ownership arrangements than it had that morning, Jin poured himself a glass of water, looked at the contracts on the table, and allowed himself, in the privacy of an empty room, a small, satisfied smile. He had sent that photograph knowing exactly what door it would open. He had been right about Du Young. He had been even more right about Keela. Some people are sharpened by neglect. Some people discover, in the space that loss creates, exactly who they were always going to be when they stopped waiting for someone else to see it first. Keela Monroe had been built for a life that mattered. She had simply needed 4 years, a beige wardrobe she donated, 19 months of port access negotiations, and one very well-timed photograph to prove it. To herself, most importantly. To him, finally. To every man in every room who had ever looked at her and seen liability, and would now, going forward, know better. The elevator in the penthouse opened at 5 a.m. She walked through first. He reached past her in the dark and turned on the lamp. It stayed on. She walked in as a ghost and walked out as the boss. If you loved watching Keela claim her power and Du Young finally surrender his pride, drop a black heart in the comments and make sure you're subscribed to the Afro-Korean Storyverse. Tell me where you're watching from, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Remember, never let anyone make you invisible.